Why are Aussie ISPs abandoning email?
And is social media imploding as Threads falters and Twitter fails?
And why are telcos killing off 3G networks?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Uniden Australia.
Hey there. Welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists and commentators to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and last week I lost my 3-year game of hide and seek with COVID, so I'm still sounding a little rough around the edges. But I'm joined, as almost always, by Alex Kidman, a man who insists that JB Hi-Fi deal where they're selling $2 Dell laptops isn't real. Alex, I saw it on Facebook. How could it not be true?
Well, Adam, you've asked me to kind of keep this short and tight, so I'll put it in really simple terms. It's a scam.
It's a scam.
It's a
That's a
scam.
trap.
And it's a really rubbish scam because it seems to think that JB Hi-Fi is a women's clothing store, that all JB Hi-Fis are located within Walmarts, and that JB Hi-Fi sells cutlery. So it's not a great scam, but having written about it this week and having posted about it being a scam and Facebook profiting from it because it's sponsored, I'm now, of course, getting even more versions of the scam than ever before.
So this was a sponsored ad. So someone's put out this scam and then got it and then paid for other people to be able to see it. And Facebook hasn't gone, hey, this isn't a bit dodgy.
Facebook has essentially gone, hey, your money tastes good.
Oh.
And that seems to be about as far as it's gone. Every single time it's popped up after the initial one, I've reported it, and they do seem to have slowed down. But just a reminder, folks, that, if you see it online, it does not necessarily mean it's true. I mean, I'm still trying to get to the bottom of whether or not Adam was sick last week or if there's a link between him and that Melbourne guy running around in his underwear with ducklings in it setting fires. Adam, you're
Hey,
innocent of that one, right?
Don't knock it till you've tried it. Real comfort.
That doesn't sound like a denial to me, sir.
Anyway, I've got to go and cancel all these orders for $2 laptops. So while I do that, Alex caught up earlier with The Guardian's Josh Taylor to look at why Aussie telcos are forcing customers to ditch email addresses that they've had for decades. And then after that, speaking of old school, Alex and I will take a look at the demise of 3G and the rise of threads on the web.
Okay, so email is one of those kind of fundamental parts of the internet. We always kind of think of it as always there, generally reliable, kind of slow, a little bit archaic, but it's still a building block of the way we communicate online. But for a number of Australians, they've gotten very, very upset this week about email. I'm joined by the Guardian's Josh Taylor to discuss this. Josh, why are Australians upset over email?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a looming battle, 20 plus years ago before Gmail existed, before all that sort of stuff, you'd usually get your email from your internet service provider. And that was just sort of the standard. Like, a lot of people have always just had the same address. And if you haven't moved in the last 20, 30 years, if you haven't changed your internet service provider, even as you've come onto the MBA and everything like that, you probably still got the same address you had like 20, 30 years ago, just because it's that one way of contacting you. Everyone knows that address, or all the things that you've signed up for are on that address. But we're seeing quite a bit of anger because TPG is now, TPG, which owns the vast array of companies that they've had over the years, mainly through the absorption of IINet. They're now getting out of the email business, and they're transitioning. They're giving the service over to another company that will basically run it for about a year for free for these customers, and then potentially looking at charging them or having an ad-based model and stuff like that. And a lot of people feel a bit blindsided by it. They think that it was working perfectly fine for them, and they think that it was part of their broadband package, and they don't really want to have to move over. And those who don't want to move over are now facing the prospect of having to basically figure out how to detangle their not Big Pond address, but their IINet address, their WestNet address, all those sorts of ones that they've had for 30 years, and make sure that they can convert over to some new address.
I mean, you're not wrong of it being the absolute standard. I was working as a tech journalist at the time and had, in fact, an ISP affiliated email until I shifted over to self-hosted and never really looked back.
Mm.
Is this, as I've seen a few people kind of proclaim, a kind of an older internet users problem?
I think in a lot of ways it is. I've been thinking about this when I was putting together the story that I've written about it. It's basically that I think if you're the person who runs the household and you've had the internet account in your name and things like that, you're probably one of the people who still has these sorts of accounts. I think particularly for probably millennials and younger, you've either always had a Gmail or a Hotmail address as a default, like you've never been on your parents' account. And then you've got the other situation where it's like once you move out of home, you're probably in a share house for the first couple of years. You're not going to be, sharing your email address with your housemates and things like that. So there's always just been this sort of, I guess, expectation that you'll just carry your email address independently wherever you go, and it's probably Gmail or Hotmail or a self-hosted one like that. So it does seem to be a problem that's mainly you're sort of affecting older customers, particularly probably boomers more than anyone else is where I'm thinking going with this. But yeah, I did hear from quite a few people who, have been living in their house for 30 years and have just had one email address, and it's something that they're having to think about whether they're going to keep it or not.
And TPG, if I understand correctly, I think they've given people till November is when they're going to switch over to this secondary, what is it, the messaging company, I think, to their services, and then they get this year of theoretically free email hosting.
Yeah, so a lot of people have written into me and saying, "Oh, I've never been actually alerted to by TPG yet that I've got to convert over." So they're given 42 days from the time that the email is sent to them. So if you haven't received anything yet, don't stress out. You've still got a couple of months.
Maybe check your junk mail folder,
Yeah,
though.
that too as well. The thing is, like, it's such a long process for TPG because they do have so many of those different brands. They've got, Internode, Westnet, INET, Dodo, Atom, yeah, Supernode was one that came
Did
up.
they end up with Aussie Mail? I think
They
might
still have a few
Yeah.
active Aussie mails. I checked into that
Yeah.
as well. So yeah, there's just so many that they've got to go through, and apparently they're all run on very different systems. And I think part of the I spoke to the messaging company as part of the story, and part of the thing is that, like, in a lot of cases, they're actually having to have someone go over to TPG's offices, put stuff on like large hard drives, and then move it over to their own infrastructure as well. So it's like there's a physical
Old school
process in
sneaking it. I mean,
yeah,
wow.
yeah. There's a physical process involved for this, so it sounds like it's a big operation that they're trying to get done over the next few months. Whether they actually meet that deadline, we'll see. But I have a feeling that for some of those ones, it might end up being extended anyway.
Yeah, I've got to say, having looked over what the messaging companies put up, it's not terribly reassuring. I'm not in this situation, but if I was looking at it, they've got this kind of very vague, frequently asked questions section. There's really no indication of what it's likely to cost. And I suppose it is worth pointing out they're part of a much larger company which does corporate email hosting. But of course, you can't even find out what they charge because all of that stuff is done on a quoted basis anyway.
Yeah, and when I was speaking to them, I get the impression that I guess the consumer-facing business still is fairly new for them, so they're sort of muddling their way through it. And the way that they sort of explained it to me is that, with inflation and everything like that going on, we don't really know what we want to charge. A lot of companies would not be telling us what they're going to charge us September next year for services because many things can change. And I understand the rationale for that, but I think, yeah, for a lot of people who, for the first time, may end up having to pay for their email service if they want to stay with this company, then it's not really reassuring. I think the way that they're trying to sell it now is like, you can come over, you've got a year. If you, for whatever reason, decide within the course of the next year you don't want to be with us, then you can figure out how to move away. And I think that would obviously give a lot of people the ability to go through their inbox and figure out what services they need to switch over, because I think, like, one of the things is, like, only get your tax invoices a couple of times a year. Like, there's so many services that you may not be aware of using your existing address on that you probably need to figure out if you're going to move over. So I think that, giving them 12 months will probably give them enough time to figure it out.
I suppose that's true. Is TPG's rationale here just basically kind of the bottom money line, or are there other concerns?
I think that's probably a big part of it. I think the other thing is, like, so it's not just like running the servers and all that sort of stuff. It's also like they are the administrators. You have to, if you're having a problem with services and stuff like that, it'd be one of the reasons that you call TPG, and having to sort of look after that is obviously a big issue. I think the other thing is obviously security. So you've got a case where they saw what was happening with Optus last year with the massive data breach, and they're like, what are our vulnerable systems? What is going to cause us problems down the track? And if you've got like the way the way I understand how TPG is internally is that you have like 10 different, because they've absorbed so many internet service providers over the years, you've got so many different systems all running at once, and if one of them has like a major issue, then it's going to cause them a lot of headaches. So I can understand that they just want to get this out of the way and get it out of it. I think they're going through a lot of sort of tech consolidation at the moment as well to sort of get everyone onto the one system, and I think this is probably part of that.
The figures around this that I could find are kind of rubbery, but I've seen the suggestion that TPG as an entire entity, including all of its little subsidiary ISPs, is somewhere maybe like 20-25% of Australia's internet service provision is through them, roughly speaking. Have we heard anything from anyone else? And obviously, the elephant in the room here is splashing around in a big pond.
Yeah, so I have been sort of pushing Telstra on that a bit in the last couple of weeks. So they it looked like they were going to get rid of the Big Pond brand a few years ago, but when so Vicky Brady, the CEO, was asked about it this week when they had their results, they're like, no, we recognise that it's a big thing that our customers are keen on, and we're continuing to offer the service. We're actually we're putting it on a new platform and trying to keep it going. So I think that's probably a recognition of just I think what the Big Pond customer base is like as well. And probably who a lot of the people who are investors in Telstra as well are. So I can see why that they want to sort of differentiate themselves that way. I was actually surprised that they're keeping running. I mean, I know it's probably a bit easier for Telstra to manage because I know that they switched over to Microsoft a few years ago. So like it's sort of like it's internally hosted still, but I think they've probably got a pretty good platform for it now. So it's probably a bit more manageable than all these ones that TPG is trying to wrangle at the moment.
Fair enough. And obviously, I mean, you mentioned Optus and breaches and so on, and they've got a reasonably large broadband share. Any word from them?
From what I can tell, they're still offering it. It doesn't seem to be. It's one of those things where it's like it's not really something that is a selling point for all of these companies now. It's just, oh, we do have this service. So I think it's probably one of those ones where if you've had it for 20 plus years, your OptusNet or whatever email address, you're probably still going. But I wouldn't imagine that many people would be considering it if they're signing up for a new service at the moment.
I've got to be honest, I actually had to look up whether or not my ISP did provide email as part of my existing package. It turned out that they did. I just never taken any advantage of it ever.
Yeah, I'm with Superloop because I was one of those customers who got switched from the other ISP that recently got shut down. I don't think it came with email at all because it's a very sort of bare bones. And I think that was the other thing, like with the advent of the NBN and in theory, a lot of smaller internet service providers popping up, they were never going to really offer like massive emails or anything like that. And it makes much more sense if you're going to go to a Google or a Microsoft or any one of those companies that do this dedicated service. I think it will be interesting to see for the messaging company if they how it goes for them, I guess, from on a consumer level, because I can see there's an argument to be made that if you maybe want someone who is locally based, you can get on the phone, providing services. Maybe it's something that people would be willing to pay for, because like if you're having a problem with your Gmail, you're not going to get much service from Google directly, are you? It's going to be a bit harder to get anything out of them. And I think that particularly like a lot of the customers who are going to be coming over probably want a bit more service and help.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. As I say, I mean, I switched over to my own hosted stuff literally now decades ago. And I wonder about the economics of how much you could charge a consumer for it. Because while hosting has obviously some of its own challenges, and there's a bit of you need a little bit of technical nous to get it up and running safely and securely, it's not super expensive. I wouldn't have thought there were big margins here.
No, you wouldn't think so. And I think that if you look at I guess the rationale from the messaging company is that they wouldn't go into exactly how many customers they're bringing over, but it seems to be enough that it's worthwhile them trying to push this through. And I know that like TPG is obviously going to be paying them for about a year to move the customers over, and I imagine it's not very cheap for them. So I don't know. Well, I guess I have to see.
Presumably,
I think,
it's cheaper than running the servers themselves.
Yeah. Well, when I was talking to them, they were saying that even though it looks like from some point of view that ISP sort of based email is dying a little bit. He was saying that there's a lot of pushes in other markets, like in America and stuff like that, where ISPs want to actually offer this as a new product again, saying, we'll keep it secure, we'll have all your information in there and stuff like that. But I haven't seen that here. Like it's treated very differently. Everyone just kind of goes, well, we've got Gmail, we've got Hotmail, that works for us.
Yeah, I suppose it is good enough for a lot of people. You mentioned earlier this kind of issue of email not just being email, and it strikes me that it is one of those things that I think people need to consider. This issue, if you changed your email, if you said, right, well, I'll drop my TPG, my INET, my internet, whatever it might be, it's not just I'm going to get, those messages from my uncle um, every day with terrible jokes in them. It's also, that's probably your login for
Mm-hmm.
maybe dozens and dozens of services.
Yeah, and you won't even think about it until you have that service that you maybe use once a year that you don't even think about, and then you're prompted with a password reset, and you're like, oh, I don't have access to that email anymore. So that does make it a lot harder. The other thing that came up is that one of the guys I was speaking to, he was saying that he doesn't have social media. His family, like a lot of his families and like acquaintances that he's met over the years, have that email address. It's kind of part of his identity, and like it's the easiest way for people to contact him online. So like where you and I might go to Twitter or Facebook or something like that, like a lot of people,
maybe not Twitter anymore, but yes,
maybe not Twitter anymore, but yes, a lot of people that it is their point of contact, and if you're not running your own website or something, and you're not as Googleable as journalists might be, it's really hard to find and get in contact with people. So I can understand that people might have not just a sentimental attachment, but like feel like they're maybe closing off a communications path for them.
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised actually that TPG didn't also offer, or at least at this stage hasn't offered, just a simple forwarding service, which would, I guess, solve for some of those communication problems.
Yeah, I think they'll probably maybe. I mean, if they've got to transfer it all over to the messaging service anyway, they might just say, just do that if you want to sign up for it. I think probably part of the issue is that we're still fairly on in the process of customers. Like the customers have not moved over yet. They've just sort of indicated an interest in actually moving over. So I think from a like corporate communications point of view, I don't think it's been handled particularly well, because it's if like a lot of customers have felt like it's a bit like a hostage situation. They don't really have a choice, and they're kind of being roped into this, where it's basically just saying, no, we've got this privacy law that we've got to deal with, and if you want to go to this stage, then we're going to go through this. And I think it probably could have been communicated a lot better.
Yeah, I suppose we'll have to wait and see how all of that rolls. Well, thank you so much for your time, Josh. Now, if people do want to find you, maybe not so much on Twitter, but elsewhere, where can they do that on the web or social media?
The best place is just my author profile page on The Guardian. Otherwise, I am on Blue Sky at Josh Taylor. That's probably the easiest way. I'm increasingly using more Blue Sky. I think it's slowly taking off. So that's probably going to be the easiest way at the moment.
Okay, and a question without notice. The other story from The Guardian, of course, possibly the finest story The Guardian's published this week. Can you explain the man in Melbourne with ducklings in his underwear setting fires?
Yeah, I did see that. I have no idea what's going on with that one. It's just such a strange story. I read it and I was going, I feel like there's more that we're not hearing about. Where does one actually acquire ducklings? I guess there's like maybe on the Yarra.
It's not the question I would have asked, but sure.
Yeah, well, fires, arson aside, it's just like I think the location of the ducks is probably an important question too, outside of the underwear situation.
Enjoying the show? That's great. Don't forget to subscribe, which you can do on every podcast platform you've ever heard of. Just search for Vertical Hold, or go to our website, verticalhold.com.au, where we've got handy buttons for every single podcast platform.
So, Alex, it feels like we were just here talking about the 2G shutdown. I'm sure it was longer ago than it seems, but what's going on here with the 3G shutdown?
So the bad news for anyone still rocking a 3G only handset or device, because it's not just phones, of course, is that the clock really is ticking. It does depend on which network you're with, but you've got at best something like, 12 months at most depending on your network, and quite a bit less to get your house in order and basically upgrade to the 4G world at least.
And why are they doing this?
So all three of Australia's networks, so that's Telstra, Optus and Vodafone, have said that they're doing this, and they're doing it for the same reason, actually, that they did the 2G shutdown. It's that they don't have as many customers only relying on those networks, and they can use the spectrum, the radio waves that they've got the rights to, for better 4G and 5G coverage rather than effectively sort of wasting it on 3G.
But the thing is that the lower Gs always have the broader coverage. So the worry is that when they get rid of 2G or 3G and say we'll use it to bolster 4G or 5G, is their actual footprint going to be smaller than before if you're out in the middle of nowhere where you're relying on 3G?
Well, theoretically, no. It will depend on the handset. It will depend on the coverage. And I suppose actually we should mention, I did mention at the start that they've all got different timelines. We should mention what those timeframes actually are. So if you're a Vodafone customer, the clock really is ticking because the 15th of December 2023 is the magic date at which Vodafone and Vodafone MVNOs, so that's Kogan and a couple of others, they'll all lose 3G because that network gets shut off. TPG as well, of course, because that's the parent
Yeah.
company there. And iiNet and Internode and all the other various weird little TPG sub-brands. And then Telstra's next in line. They've said 30th of June 2024, so that's next year. Their 3G network goes bye-bye. And then Optus is last in line. September 2024 is when we will see the last 3G in mainland Australia.
So how old does your handset have to be roughly to not support anything higher than 3G?
Look, it's a really, really open question. I've been thinking about this when we decided on this as a topic. Because the reality is, it's been a fairly long time since there's been 3G only handsets on the market as new. But the problem is, some of these things stick around on store shelves or, for that matter, internet enabled warehouses for years and years and years and come up as bargain basement things that granny's got so you can get in touch with her. There's kind of perception that often these shutdowns affect older Australians more. I think in that case, that's probably fairly true because I think if you're hanging on to a 3G handset now, you're probably not so fussed about data speeds. That being said, one of the other little weird quirks of this is it's not just 3G handsets. There are some very early 4G handsets that might be affected by this too.
Okay. Because as you say, the problem might be also that people are relying on hand-me-down 3G handsets, and with Nana, it might be hand-me-up. You get rid of your old phone, you give it to a relative, so they don't have to go and buy a phone. So you might be right, but you've handed them something that's only going to be good for the next 6 or 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely true. And you also need to check, just on that 3G, 4G thing, you need to check whether or not they're voice over LTE capable, because this is kind of the handover shift that you need. The only one of the big three telcos that's actually put up a list of devices so far is Optus, what they call their affected devices list, or devices that may be affected. The interesting ones in there are a trio of iPhones, the iPhone 5, 5C, and 5S. And that's to do with the band's coverage of those models as sold by Optus way back when the iPhone 5 series was brand new. Some of those are 4G capable phones, but they don't have the necessary voice over LTE parts. And again, I think at this stage, if you're hanging on to one of those phones, it's probably more because you want it as a phone and texting machine, not so much on the data side.
Yeah, I see the Galaxy S5 and the Pixel 2s on there as well.
Yeah, and also a bunch of cheaper like Optus branded phones and a few lower cost models that I believe Optus has ranged itself as its cheap prepaid phones, and every telco's got them. The thing with this as well, though, is it's actually, I think, a little easier these days to get hold of a reasonably affordable 4G phone that'll certainly see you good probably for the life of the phone itself. There's quite a few kind of, I'm going to say $80 to $200 phones out there that would be a huge step up from anyone who's still rocking a 3G only phone.
I don't know if I'd inflict an $80 phone on anybody, though. That's going to be pretty average.
But Adam, your standards are different. So I've actually been testing a bunch of these real budget phones of late. And the thing you need to realize with that market is the expectations are not high because they don't really want it to do much. If your needs are really low, you don't necessarily need a high grade premium phone or even something mid range. If you don't care about the camera, if you're not gaming or surfing the web on it, if you're basically just making calls, maybe sending or receiving a few texts, it just needs to be a screen, a battery, and a receiver. And yes, some $80 phones are not much more than that tied together with string,
Yeah.
but doesn't need to be fancy if it gets the job done.
Okay. Well, see, the last time around, I was looking at my articles from last time, I think it's 2015. So my parents were still on Nokia 3200s, which of course were going because they were 2G phones. So I moved them over to Motorola Moto Gs, and they were third generations back then. And I've checked, they're actually thankfully 4G phones as well. So because they're still rocking those phones nearly 10 years later, they are getting a bit long in the tooth and maybe ready for an upgrade. But so and they were sort of $300-400 phones, and I would think you'd want to go the same again. But you reckon you can get away with a bit less if your needs are really simple?
If your needs are really simple and if you're not going massively online, the one thing I'd say about a 10-year-old Android phone, especially, but even an iPhone actually, is I wouldn't be doing a whole lot online with that
Security,
because the
yeah.
security issues do start to become a bit more pressing. The budget phones that you see in that kind of $100 to $200 space, yeah, they don't always see a whole lot of Android updates, although they tend to be current right now. But again, if you're not doing a whole lot online that needs that level of security, then well, it's certainly better than losing your coverage. This also, though, becomes a little bit more interesting given the recent news out of TPG and Telstra. I think we talked about this a little while back. TPG and Telstra's deal got blocked
Mm.
by the ACCC to share regional towers and spectrum. And part of that, of course, would have been around those areas that now those networks are going to be shutting down in order to refarm that 3G spectrum. They can't share it, but the regional picture, I think, gets a little bit more murky as a result.
Yeah. So as we watched the artist formerly known as Twitter pretty much, deteriorate in front of our eyes, there's no one who's really standing up as a very clear replacement. It's still quite fragmented and everybody's getting their act together. This week, Threads came through with a feature that some people might have assumed was already there. What is it and how might that help them gain some ground?
So Threads, for anyone joining the conversation late, is Meta. That's Facebook, basically. Facebook's version of Twitter. There's a certain
That's
amount of
X.
legal rumbling around that. It's Twitter/X with the serial numbers filed off. It's a social media microblogging service of that style. But one of the things that they did not have at launch at all was any kind of web client. So if you wanted to post to Threads, you had to do so basically from a phone or tablet through the Threads app only. It was quite limiting. I mean, incredibly limiting, actually, because you could only really tie it to a single Instagram account as well. So it felt a little half baked, and I've got to be honest, it limited the way I've used Threads because so many of these services I run in different browser tabs on a desktop platform, and then sometimes updating via a phone when I need to.
Yeah. And is that part of the problem that I'm seeing here is that all of these services seem too fragmented. And the thing with Twitter, love it or hate it, it was the place where everybody was. It was the de facto online town square. We're talking about Threads, we're talking about Mastodon, we're talking about Blue Sky, we're talking about others. Is any one of them shaping up to take that role on? Or as Twitter disintegrates, could we actually lose that concept of a central place?
I suspect, and this is all just kind of thinking off the top of my head because
That's what we do. That's why we get paid the big bucks.
And look, that's the nature of social media at the moment. Let's be clear here. My hot take, as it were, to put it in a social media context, would be that I think we will end up with someone picking up most of that slack, but it's really not clear who it's going to be at this point. I mean, with Threads getting the web client, I looked up what Meta had to say about it, and there's this line which really caught my eye as their kind of latest little blog update. Mark Zuckerberg just announced that we're rolling out a web experience for Threads over the coming days, which just sounds like a super frustrated developer going, he said what? We're doing what and how quickly?
Which is basically life 24/7 at Twitter right now.
I'm not sure that there is life at Twitter.
Yes.
But this week in Elon craziness, I mean, just continues, and it feels like he's accelerating What's he doing with news headlines, Adam? What's this story
Well,
about?
this I don't understand. I think what it means is in Twitter, well, there's no third party clients anymore. So in Twitter, if
X.
you, yeah, X, if you paste a link to an article that I wrote or Alex wrote, it will turn that into like an embedded thing. So what the people see on the other end when they look at the post is not just the URL, but also it's grabbed the headline, it's grabbed the image, it's turned into a clickable link. So it's like a preview, I guess, of what that article is all about. Now, as far as I can tell, they're stripping that right back. So if you post in a link now, all that will be embedded is the image, the main image from the article, but no details about what it's about, no snippet, no headline. It's almost like they don't want people to go and look at news articles.
I well, I mean, I feel like this is a functionality that's not always worked cleanly
True.
anyway. It's always been a bit hit and miss. It feels to me more like what Elon's trying to do here is force those companies to spend a bit more time on the platform, because the way around this, if you thought that X was useful to you, would be to handcraft that, would be to
Yeah.
say, here is my story written by Adam, and here is what it is about. Here is an image and a URL, and then that's going to work. That will tell people what they need to know. But of course, that takes more time. And then you're on the platform for longer, maybe seeing some ads, maybe getting up all of those individual metrics that Elon wants to crow about so much. But he hasn't stopped there either. The one that really grabbed my attention was that Elon Musk wants to get rid of the block button in Twitter. And I've seen so many people say, right, that's it. I've kind of stuck around for ages, but if he gets rid of blocking, I'm out of there, because there's just way too many dangerous people on Twitter.
Well, this is what we talked about the other week, is that with the ABC pulling back on
Mm.
Twitter, is that really it's a health and safety issue in some ways. If you're asking your people to manage your social media, you're basically exposing them to a toxic environment.
Mm.
And the block button is actually one of the few hazmat protections that you have, to get rid of that is just insane. But of course, this is the guy who still will happily hit the block button for anyone else. So maybe it's just a special Elon block button. What's he expect you to do? Just mute people instead?
Muting would appear to be it, and I think it falls into this idea of Elon being a free speech absolutist, except, as you
Oh,
say, when it
yeah.
regards speech regarding Elon, at which point, yes, the special shiny gold-plated $44 billion Elon block button will get used. But he wasn't done there yet either. We've talked before, in fact, we talked kind of from the point at which he started sacking loads and loads and loads of people, including developers, that Twitter was going to be a bit of a buggy mess, and that things, might not survive past the weekend and so on. It looks like some of that collapse has started to happen, because pretty much all the photo and a bunch of the link content earlier than 2014 on Twitter, sorry, on X, is gone.
Does that really matter though? That's like 10 years old. And in terms of social media, that's like, the from the 30s. That's just ancient. Does anybody really care about that anymore?
My history nerd is crying right now, Adam.
But this
Yes, it
is
matters.
social media. It's not.
No,
I
but
mean,
it
I
matters.
sound like one of
You
those media snobs who says there
you
is,
think you
real
think about
media
some of the
and
things that were happening
yeah,
2014 and before, that social media enabled, that social media allowed people to communicate through war zones, that social
true.
media gave a snapshot of where people were at socially and politically. There's huge swathes of important content there. And yes, it's very easy to kind of say, oh, look, it's just Twitter. It doesn't matter. It's these tiny little messages that people send back and forth. But they give us a view of what humanity is. I mean, I'm not saying all humanity's on Twitter. Don't get me wrong. I'm not
Yeah.
overinflating it to that degree. But they give us an important viewpoint into the past. And yeah, no, I think this stuff does matter. And I think it's a huge crying shame. And as far as I can tell, as far as anyone can tell, because of course, X does not have a PR department because they got fired too.
Poop emoji.
It would appear that this is actually not even deliberate. It's just a bug. That they got rid of all this stuff by accident.
See, following on from this, like what I said about looking back in time, we still keep copies of newspapers from 100 years ago. They're on microfiche in the library and whatever. You got to go, but they are there because they are a record of the
I
times.
haven't
If
seen
you
a
want to
library
go
with
back,
microfiche in a long, long time, Adam. You're showing
going
your
back
age.
to my
But anyway,
uni days
go,
here,
yeah, go on.
But it's there if you need to see it as a record of the times. whether or not people will be sitting down in 100 years' time and looking back on this is questionable. But I can also see why people would argue that newspapers are useless, that you throw them away tomorrow. Why would you need to keep them either? So the fact that I can see the value of hanging on to a newspaper from 100 years ago means that I guess need to accept that some people would also be able to see the value of hanging on to some of this social media record to have for 100 years from now.
Yeah, and I think, look, I think it's not just historical research either. It's showing trends in how people communicated as well. Because you've got to bear in mind that, we're still relatively, it feels like the internet's been around forever. And for some people, of course, it's been around their entire lives. But we're still relatively in the infancy of it in terms of that ability for global communication. And this is, still, I would say, certainly 100 years from now, someone will look back and go, right, well, those are the early years of how we communicated through that medium. Look at how it's evolved now that we telepathically send, images to each
Oh,
other's
God.
heads in real time
That's bad.
over the galaxies or something. I don't know. I'm not going to be here in 100 years, I'm pretty sure. But no, I think this stuff is important. And I think it's incredibly regrettable that it's been removed. But again, I've said it before, it's Elon's toy. He spent an awful lot of money on it. And if he wants to break bits and throw them out of the pram, I suppose he's free to do that too. Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Josh for joining us earlier. And as always, if you want to chat to us, if you want to talk to us about the shutdown of 3G, about Facebook scams, about social media, about whether or not your ISP should supply email to you, then you can catch us on the Vertical Hold webpage on Facebook, Instagram. You can look up Adam or me on Mastodon, Blue Sky, or indeed Threads, possibly on the web by the time you read this. Oh, and X/Twitter, if it's still around by the time you read this. Read this, hear this. My brain is going. Adam, over to you.
Thanks, everyone, for dropping by. And don't forget, the secret is to bang the rocks together.
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Uniden Australia.